So she is the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to ask you first if you can tell us anything new about the meetings that are going on in Iraq today to try to come up with this post-war Iraq government.
I'm not sure that I can tell you anything new, or at least not anything that wasn't in the papers this morning, but I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good initiative. This is something that should have happened a long time ago. What we discovered was that we had a rolling liberation inside Iraq, and areas were liberated perhaps a little bit before our military and our political leaders expected. And as the military wanted to move on, what was left behind? There was no government, no local government, no basic facilities. I'm not even talking about ideology. Just sort of local governments, water, electricity, who's going to make the trains run on time. And had we had a more robust partnership with Iraqis on the ground and with some of the opposition groups, we would have been able to I think, send a better message to people that there wasn't going to be a vacuum, that there wouldn't have been as much chaos, that perhaps local order could have been restored a little more quickly. General Garner, the head of the Office of Reconstruction for the United States government, is now doing just that in Nasiriyah, and I imagine this is the first of several meetings. But it's a good idea.
What is going to be the key element of making those meetings work and of making the U.S. presence or lack of presence in Iraq work?
That's the $64,000 question. I guess we haven't had inflation with the $64,000 question, but it is. You know, it's difficult. One of the things that we're seeing on the ground, particularly in southern Iraq, but also in other areas, there's a lot of other countries who have pernicious interests are interfering. So we're seeing Iranian-backed groups boycotting in Nasiriyah. The Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq is boycotting the meeting. And I'm not entirely distressed by that, frankly. I'm not sure that we want to see them as part of a new government, but there's no question that they speak for some people on the ground in southern Iraq. The problem is that they're a wholly owned subsidiary of the government of Iran, which is a strategic enemy of the United States and of Iraq. So what will make this work is a spirit of cooperation. What will make this work is a willingness on our part not to play games politically with the parties. And I think that we have not had the resolve in recent years, and particularly in recent months, to quell our own internal government bickering to the extent that we can reflect that on the Iraqi people as well.
Well, I want to ask you about that because yesterday we had Robert Dreyfus on our program who writes for the American Prospect, and he had written a piece about post-war Iraq, and you were in it. And he talked about you on the program yesterday a little bit. We want to show you what he said and give you a chance to respond. And again, he's talking all about what role different elements of the United States government have in post-war Iraq.
Well, Danny gets very emotional about this. She's very closely tied to the Iraqi National Congress. She's a strong supporter of theirs. And when I called her to ask, I said, I've been talking to people at the State Department, and they said that Chalabi was kind of a clown. She started shouting into the phone, you know, who gives a good goddamn what the State Department thinks? And I mean, in a way, I give her credit for the strength of her views and her honesty. I think she's completely wrong, though, if she thinks that Ahmed Chalabi can take the reins of power in Iraq and have any kind of semblance of credibility there.
Ms. Pletka.
He makes me feel like a movie star. What does Danny think? As if people cared. Well, I think Bob probably was mischaracterizing my views a little bit, but there's no question that the idea that somehow the United States government should be working against people who are not terrorists, not Baathists, not, in fact, enemies of the United States, and have only wanted for decades on end to remove the government of Saddam Hussein and replace it with a representative and better government for the American people is really reprehensible. We shouldn't be conducting sort of smear campaigns against individuals, whether it's Ahmed Chalabi or others, I should add. This desire on the part of, and it's not just the State Department, it's certain parties within the government, to pick and choose among Iraqis as if somehow there are legitimate Iraqis and illegitimate Iraqis, rather than Iraqis who espouse beliefs that are unacceptable to the vast mass of Iraqi people, such as former members of the Ba'ath Party, is really wrong. It's a bad signal that the United States sends. It's the kind of interference that has gotten us in trouble in the past. And, you know, at the end of the day, what we want to do is create an environment in which the Iraqi people can choose for themselves. By doing it ourselves in advance, we send a really bad message about what we believe in.
Post-war Iraq is our topic this morning. Our guest is Danielle Pletka. She is Vice President, Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. Our phone lines are open, 202-585-3880. If you support the war, 202-585-3881. If you oppose the war, we're just dividing the lines that way in order to get different thoughts on it. Now, earlier this morning, we were talking about Syria and what impact that might have next. And one of our viewers said it didn't matter whether we did diplomatic, let's say if we pulled our ambassador out of Syria, or we did economic sanctions, or we went in militarily, any of those would be sending the wrong signal to Arabs about what the United States plans are in that part of the world.
Well, I'm not sure that anything we do would send the wrong signal, but you know, clearly we want people to understand that this is not a march of the third ID from Baghdad to Tehran to Damascus, and points beyond. On the other hand, people need to understand that what concerns the United States government about Syria is not what has been going on these many years, which is very troubling. In other words, state sponsorship of terrorism, harboring terrorists, amassing weapons of mass destruction, interference in the peace process, not to speak of just a lousy dictator to the Syrian people. No, that's not what the problem is at this moment. It's the fact that the Syrian government is actively interfering in our operations in Iraq and trying to get American soldiers killed, period. That's not okay. And if the Syrian government isn't smart enough to wake up and smell the coffee, then there have to be consequences. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean bomb tomorrow, but it does mean that we need to have a very robust dialogue. And by the way, people should understand, this didn't start with Don Rumsfeld standing up and saying, you're bad. There were very, very serious private discussions that have been going on before the war, at the beginning of the war, and throughout the war. But the Syrian government only closed its border at the end of last week. That shows you that they're a little bit tone deaf. We need to deal with that problem because we need to protect our soldiers and we want to protect the future of Iraq.
I was looking for, I think it's the New York Times editorial on that this morning.
Yeah, I saw
It
it.
says that this may be the really big issue for the Bush administration coming up next.
Well, again, Syria, Iran, and other countries have been allowed for many years to play this game of destabilization through terrorists, through proxies. And we want to make sure that Iraq does not become another field in which they feel that they can send Hezbollah terrorists, that they can blow people up, that they can interfere in the reconstruction and rehabilitation of the country.
First call for Danielle Pletka is Holiday, Florida.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
Danielle, it's not that I disagree with what you say, but the people of Iraq needed us there. I mean, they needed help. Nobody else was going to do it. They were under a dictator for, 25 years. So somebody needed to go in there and help them, so why not us? It helps out our country and others to keep terrorism down.
Oh, I don't disagree at all. I think that it's less a question of why not, which implies a certain passivity. I think that the United States actually stands for something in the world today. We enjoy enormous liberty. We enjoy religious freedom. We enjoy political freedom. We can change our government whenever we feel like it. That doesn't mean we need to go from country to country delivering those liberties to people, but certainly we ought to be making an effort. And in the case of Iraq, there was a national security imperative. There was a long, long diplomatic process, and we came to the end of all of the other options we had for removing weapons of mass destruction and liberating the people of Iraq. We did the right thing.
Is it Geneseo, Illinois?
Geneseo.
Geneseo.
Illinois.
I saw it wrong. Thanks. Go ahead.
I want to take to task this idea that excluding all former Ba'ath Party officials in Iraq. I mean, from all accounts that I've heard, the only way you can seek any kind of position of note in Iraq for the last couple of years is some sort of Ba'ath Party membership. It may not be, they may not even believe the ideology, but that was the only way to survive. And effectively excluding the Ba'ath Party would mean that you're excluding most of anybody of note in Iraq, and many Iraqis don't trust the people, especially that have been nurtured by Washington, D.C. think tanks, and they may not receive them very well.
Oh, yes, Washington, D.C. think tanks. We're really ruling the world, if only. You make a really good point, which is that the Ba'ath Party is enormous, and to hold certain positions inside the Iraqi government, and even minor teaching positions in Iraq, you may have had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party. So de-Ba'athification, the process of removing those kinds of leaders from Iraq, is not meant to be a massive purge of any card-carrying member of the Ba'ath Party, because you're right, the result would be the loss of a functioning cadre inside the country. What you need to do is make a distinction. What we need to do and what the Iraqi people will need to do is to make a distinction between those who were forced members and active rulers, leaders, local enforcers in the Ba'ath Party. There have been estimates about the numbers. I've heard 25,000, I've heard 10,000, but remember there are millions of members of the Ba'ath Party. So no matter what, we're really talking about slicing off the top. No one is talking about rooting down any deeper, because it is an impractical prospect. I'd like to actually answer the other question as well, which is on the issue of the viability of exiles. You know, leaving your country when your country is ruled by a brutal dictator, going out, making money, raising a family, and using your freedom to try and liberate your people is not discrediting. These people who are sort of being called exiles, as if that is somehow distinct from real Iraqis who stayed on the ground, is an enormous injustice. Imagine to yourself in other countries, there are people who are outside Syria or Iran, Libya, fighting for the liberation of their country. Chinese in this country who are fighting for the liberalization of China, just to take it out of the Middle East. Is it really just for us to say, you're just not authentic. You're not a real guy, because you left. You refused to suffer under those people, and you left to fight. That's not fair, and it's not right, and I don't think it's true that people like Shalaby and others do not have legitimacy among the Iraqi people.
Clarksville, Maryland.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Thank you. I have a question. Since you're with the American Enterprise Institute, you might know about what you see about the big picture, and whether it would be wise, in fact, to go into Syria if the point of this is to establish an American presence in the Middle East, as some of the writings suggest. If the United States went into Syria right now and got rid of a government which has a very bad history, I don't know about the new person, whether he's likely to change that, could they then pull some of the troops out of, or maybe entirely out of Saudi Arabia, places where it really upsets a lot of Arabs to have American troops, and then accomplish the goal of having a big American presence in a very important region and protecting Israel, but do it really quickly and do it militarily. I don't see that the economic and diplomatic routes offer any potential.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I think that our troops are going to move out of Saudi Arabia, and I think that's going to happen no matter what goes on in Syria. The purpose of our troops being in Saudi Arabia was, it grew out of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and with the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime, there really doesn't seem to be a great purpose in them remaining there. So I think that will probably happen in short order. But, you know, I do think it's important to understand that a military accomplishment is not an end in and of itself. As we see right now in Iraq, removal of Saddam Hussein is only the halfway point, and there's a great deal more to happen, and what's going to happen is actually going to be a lot more complicated than the military campaign. You have to win a peace as well as a war. So the idea that we should take on, for example, the great what next question, should it be Syria, should it be Iran? You know, no. For the simple reason that in Syria, we don't like what the government is up to, but the government has to be given an opportunity to modify its behavior. Now, is that going to happen? We need to watch very carefully. We need to look at what the Syrian government is up to, and at the end of the day, the military option may be the only one remaining to us. But they should definitely be given an opportunity to wake up and smell the coffee. What we want to see is a gradual liberalization. What we want to see is an end to the sponsorship of terrorism. What we want to see is better government throughout the Middle East. We do not, as our goal, have a desire for troops throughout the Middle East. I think that's a lousy idea. We don't want it. The American public probably doesn't want it. And it doesn't serve any end. We're not helping the Arab people by having troops throughout the Middle East. What will help the Arab people is having better governments.
Houston, Texas.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I am an American from Assyrian origin. First, I would like to thank you for your wonderful program. And if I would have a little leeway, would like to address a point that your guest mentioned, that think tanks don't rule the world, and we wish. But you have to admit with me that think tanks do play a very big role in the make, if you wish, of the policy, the American policy. The first very important point, or actually what the most very important point, is why don't you, as a think tank, or all the intelligent people who make these big ideas about terrorism, just define what is a terrorist? If one person is defending his homeland, who's been occupied by another military force against all United Nations, including the United States, and I'm talking here, I think you know who am I talking about, which is Israel. Are these people terrorists, or are they freedom fighters? This is the main question that affects what is the United States looked upon in Syria or in any Arab country. Are we just a bunch of a gang of cowboys who just want to impose our position? This is the United States of America and not the United States of Israel.
Houston, thank you very much. Danielle, Pletka.
This is the age-old debate. You know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's that kind of moral relativism that has gotten us where we are in the Middle East. You know, a terrorist is defined in American law, but I think we also all know what a terrorist is. A terrorist is a person who's willing to blow up a kindergarten in order to attain political aims. I don't think there's a lot of dispute, and nobody is asserting that Palestinians hold the monopoly on terrorism or any such thing, or that there's not justice in a desire for a Palestinian homeland. But there are red lines that you cross as a, quote, freedom fighter, and blowing up civilians, threatening schools, discotheques, that's terrorism. Blowing yourself up at a military checkpoint, that's terrorism.
Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Hello?
You're on the air.
I'd like to make a comment about the Iraqi invasion. It seems like it was missed on TV, or maybe it wasn't. It wasn't reported on the media. But we have intelligence that Iraqi was tied to terrorism, and also we had foreign intelligence that supported that. Yet nobody has reported on that. And President Bush said we would fight terrorism wherever we found it, and we found it in Iraq. Thank you very much. Bye.
Any response?
Well, I don't want to encourage anyone to believe that we did not have a lot of coverage of the war on television or in the media, because we had pretty much blanket coverage. But the caller was right in one sense, that there wasn't a lot of focus put on the terrorist operations and the terrorist camps that we found. One of the first things that the U.S. military did was to annihilate the camp of Ansar al-Islam, a group that was based in northern Iraq, that was being supported in some ways by the government of Iran, but that was affiliated with al-Qaeda. We also found, I gather from press reports, a Palestinian terrorist training camp in another part of Iraq. I think that there are a lot of things that were found. What you've seen in the reporting is the big story in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of the smaller stories, a lot of the discoveries that have been made along the way are going to filter out more slowly. But you're absolutely right. We should be focusing on those things because they give us an idea about just how evil the Saddam Hussein regime was.
Let me ask you about a reporting story, because the CNN story has moved on to the editorial pages today and onto the television pages. It's all over the place. Here's the TV columns in the Washington Post says CNN executive defends his silence on known Iraqi atrocities. There's several editorials, including the Washington Post and the Washington Times, on it today. What's your thoughts?
I was horrified, I have to say, when I read Easton Jordan's piece in the New York Times.
Why were you horrified?
You know, you expect a minimum of frankness and honesty from American media outlets. You know, we're all, you know, some have different viewpoints, but you expect that if they know about torture, if they know about murder, that they're going to be frank, that they're willing, in fact, to lose the right to have their reporters inside Baghdad, which is what Jordan was protecting. They wanted to be able to report out of Baghdad, and so they were willing to cover up not just a little bit of, you know, graft, but murder, torture, terror, threats of assassination in order to continue reporting out of Baghdad. This is unconscionable. It's unacceptable. And to turn around at the end of the day, pat yourself on the back and say, I felt just awful about the whole thing. You know, what are they covering up elsewhere? What are they covering up in Cuba, where they're reporting? What are they covering up in other countries? This is not okay. You cannot do that. You cannot take it unto yourself as an editor or anything else to say that I get to decide that I am not going to report on this kind of thing because I want to protect, you know, my reporters. It's not right.
And he said in his memo to the CNN staff yesterday that he was also protecting other people who might be killed.
It is not the job of an editor at CNN to decide who lives and who dies. It is not if they're there to report the news, then they shouldn't be there filtering what news they're telling. No, I remember, I mean, one of my colleagues very, very nicely put it, I have to give due credit that it wasn't my line, that you know, throughout the course of the war, we were winning on Fox, it was a quagmire on CNN, and we were losing on the BBC. So you have different viewpoints, but I remember CNN sitting there being manipulated by the Iraqi information ministry, where you would see a tight shot of a poor suffering child, and suffering went on the Iraqi side without question, but of an Iraqi child in a hospital bed. Had they only panned out, we would have seen Ministry of Information people all over the place manipulating this child and the media and the shot to show, you know, a tiny corner of what had happened, which may or may not have been representative. CNN was perfectly happy to do that. So, you know, you make these decisions. They should be reporting the news. Report the news. Don't make these decisions. And if you have to make ethical compromises in order to stay, then you're doing the wrong thing. An ethical compromise is an ethical compromise.
Back to the phones. We go next to Chicago. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN taking my phone call. I have a question and I have a statement. The statement is that I'm glad Saddam Hussein is out of power and every people should be free. But my question is to your guest, when are we going to go after Prime Minister Sharon for killing Palestinian kids and Israeli kids? I would like for her to answer the question for me.
We're never going to go after Prime Minister Sharon. He is the elected leader of the government of Israel. If you're suggesting that there should be an effort to pursue an Israeli-Palestinian peace, you're absolutely right. There should be an effort to pursue an Israeli-Palestinian peace. But one of the things we need to understand is, A, peace will come between the parties. If we impose it, if we somehow go after an individual, then it's not going to be lasting and it's not going to work. And in order for there to be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, both sides have to feel a certain level of security. And that means that there has to be an end to terrorism from the Palestinian side. If there is an end, you can rest assured that not only the United States, but everybody is going to come down very hard on the Israelis on the question of troop withdrawals, on the question of settlements, and on a whole variety of other issues. But the United States is not going to tell another government that it should not protect its own people from terrorists any more than I hope you would advise President Bush not to protect our people from terrorists.
The Los Angeles Times reports in a piece by Ruth Morris today that there's problems with the picking of the cabinet and that Mr. Abbas is having some problems with that, in that there is one specifically a disagreement about certain people who had been in conjunction with Mr. Arafat, who Mr. Abbas does not want in his cabinet.
Right.
So they're saying that the whole idea of a plan might be pushed off.
This is part of the problem. You know, if one of the reasons that President Bush made a speech in June of last year in which he said the Palestinian leadership needed to change wasn't just because the current Palestinian leadership is complicit in all sorts of acts of terrorism, has been ripping off the Palestinian people for many years. It's also because there really cannot be a peace agreement between someone who is a terrorist, not to speak of lousy leader for his own people, and Israel. There needs to be new Palestinian leadership, but it can't be like the Wizard of Oz. And I think that that's really what Arafat has always thought, is that he could be the man behind the curtain. Abu Mazen, who is a long-time friend and compatriot of Yasser Arafat, has said, I'm not going to be your puppet, and I'm going to pick my own cabinet. And Arafat has shown himself, Arafat and his Fatah faction behind him have shown themselves unwilling to allow him that latitude. You know, that's not okay.
Next is South Beach, Florida.
Good morning, ladies. How
Morning.
are you?
Fine, thanks.
Danielle, don't you think that Syria was responsible for partly responsible for supporting the guerrilla movements in Lebanon for the 200 Americans that were massacred back in the late 80s? I think that Syria, has been wanting to feel the force of the United States now for a few years, and honestly, all these Arab countries are responsible for terrorism in the whole world. I mean, Cuba, Fidel Castro was in July 27th, a few months before September 11th, with the Ayatollahs in Iran, saying that together we're going to bring the Yankee imperialist dogs to their knees. Fidel Castro said this. And some of these airline hijackers who hit into the World Trade Center went through Cuba to enter the United States. And also, Cuba used biological weapons in Angola. So they have biological weapons in the island aiming at the United States of America. For 44 years, the Cuban people have been suffering under totalitarianism and communism. Isn't that enough reason to go after Cuba as well as Iran and Iraq and all these other Arab countries? At least.
No, I'm sorry, caller. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
Cuba has been in vogue recently, in recent years. Now, I'm not going to pretend to you, by the way, that I'm an expert on Cuba, because I'm not. I know my area, the Middle East and South Asia, but Cuba is not part of it. But let me say this. Cuba has been very popular, and members of Congress, business leaders have been lobbying strenuously. We need to reach out to Cuba. Castro is not a threat. I agree with the caller in many ways, although I'm not sure about the level of Cuban involvement in the various terrorist acts against the United States. There's no question. The quotes from Castro from just before September 11th from Tehran are absolutely accurate. There's no doubt that he remains an enemy of the United States. There's no doubt that he would exploit an opportunity to harm the United States. And yes, I agree that Cuba probably does have some form of biological weapons program. The issue is, can we invade everybody? Is this about going and marching in and changing the world? And the answer is that there are many different ways to change the world. We have had sanctions against Cuba. Many people believe they're ineffective. I don't happen to believe they're ineffective. To the contrary, I think we need to be very sharp about who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. But we also need to have a parallel positive message. And that is, here's what you need to do. Here's what needs to happen. It's not just that we hate you. We also care for the welfare of your people. And this is what you need to do to get back into our good graces. If we could deliver that message, and if we could have that as a priority in our diplomacy, and I would argue it has not necessarily been a priority in our diplomacy, particularly throughout the Middle East, I think we could go a long way, because we have enormous influence without the Third ID, without the 82nd Airborne, but we need to use it, and we need to use it to those ends. We shouldn't be cutting diplomatic corners and making relationships with people who are anathema to us.
Upper Marlboro, Maryland.
Yes, I'd like to make a statement, and then I'd like to ask some questions. My statement is, I believe that there's no greater terrorist state than Israel. And my question is, when Bush started this war, he didn't look at the repercussions of this war, such as where is bin Laden, where's Saddam Hussein, where's the wealth of Iraq? Has that wealth gone into a terrorist network? Where's the Republican Guard? Have they joined a terrorist network? If the money has gone, the wealth of Iraq has gone into a terrorist network, do they have enough money now to approach the white anti-government forces in this country, such as Timothy McVeigh and whatnot? I think we are really in trouble. And then when I say Timothy McVeigh, I mean the organizations that he was associated with. I think Bush has really messed up, and I think we really are going to pay a high price for this. Thank you.
Do you have any reaction?
I don't want to touch it. I don't agree with a single word the caller said. I think he's a little bit confused and rather overcome with conspiracy theories.
Clearwater, Florida.
Good morning, Danielle. What a pleasure, Danielle, to see your honesty and to feel it. And our Conservative Party really appreciates you and for your trust. What I'd like for you to address, Danielle, is the dangers of the global terrorist financing. Now, to me, my opinion, the liberals will have you think that it is not important that all these terrorist groups are receiving finance, not only from Hussein, Saddam. Remember the video that was shown where Arafat's families were salivating over the checks? Hussein checks. There is also problems, Danielle, of financing terrorism in Europe. We found my family in Europe know of this. The mosques in London were financed partly between Hussein and bin Laden and most of even Syria. You know, we've got to clamp down, Danielle. The most important aspect of this terrorist war, in my opinion, Danielle, is the financing. I know there's problems with the weapons of mass destruction, but would you please address this?
You make a very good point, and it wasn't just the flattery toward me, although thank you very much. Financing is one of those very, very tough nuts to crack because there's no question that money is the lifeblood of terrorism. And without it, terrorists have a much harder time operating. So in going forward, we have looked at, yes, Saddam Hussein and the $10,000, $25,000 he would provide to the families of suicide bombers among the Palestinians, but of course the Saudi government has been deeply involved, the Saudi government and also Saudi individuals, to be fair, outside the realm of the government, have been involved in financing Al-Qaeda, other groups, through charities. This is something terribly, terribly difficult because it's hard to track money. It's hard to figure out who owns bank accounts. It's hard to stop financial transfers. And this is one of those areas where multilateral cooperation is the key to success. If we do this alone, it's not going to work. What we need is the help of responsible countries around the world to clamp down on this, on this lifeblood of terror. But we also need to make sure that we understand where it's coming from. We need to be very, very clear with the government of Saudi Arabia and with many other governments that a loosey-goosey attitude towards funding of charities, that the idea that somehow you are giving money to a charity and not caring where it's going, that the wife of the Saudi ambassador can, perhaps in all kindness, give a check to somebody who was involved in terrorism, thinking that she might have been paying a hospital bill, is unacceptable. Drawing these bright lines is a vital step. The United States government has gone part of the way, but perhaps we haven't been quite as tough as we need to be. We need to keep pressing on this matter. You're absolutely right.
How long have you been at AEI?
1 year.
And before that?
I was for 10 years with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Doing what?
Handling the Middle East and South Asia.
Under whose chairmanship?
The chairman, but also the ranking member, because I was there when the Senate switched sides. In fact, I think I was there for a couple of switches. I'm getting old at this point. But the chairman was Jesse Helms.
And before that, a reporter?
And before that, a reporter.
Where?
I worked for a magazine owned by the Washington Times. Before that, I was based in the Middle East, and I wrote for, actually, I didn't write for anybody. I was a lowly editorial assistant and intern for a variety of news outlets from the United States.
Where are you from originally?
Australia.
Next call, Oxford, Georgia.
Yes, ma'am.
You're on the air.
Hey, I have a question. I said, if the United States, we know the United States have all this great power. We're the greatest power, superpower in the world. How is it other countries to defend themselves without the United States just imposing its will on without, if it's not going to be through terrorism? You understand what I'm saying? I mean, I can't understand this. I mean, you look at people, you cause confusion in countries over the Middle East, and then you turn around and say, hey, okay, they're terrorists. I mean, what is this? Joke, man.
Well, terrorism is unacceptable. It's an unacceptable tool for anybody. The premise of what the caller is saying is that somehow the United States will use its great power, and I don't disagree that we are the world's greatest power, for ill. And I don't agree with that. You know, we're not going around bullying countries that don't need a good dose of bullying, I would argue. We are not wantonly invading countries. We haven't yet invaded France, though some of my colleagues have been tempted. So the idea that somehow the United States doesn't have the restraint, doesn't have the responsibility that goes with great leadership, I think is wrong. It's unfair, and the idea that as a counterweight there should be terrorism, that somehow this is a legitimate counterweight to our force is really wrong. The targeting of civilians for political purposes is always wrong. It demeans the cause. It is always the wrong choice.
C-SPAN cameras will be at the American Enterprise Institute today, where we'll be attending a conference that will be moderated by our guest, Danielle Pletka, who's all going to be speaking.
You put me on the spot. Who do we have this morning? We do a weekly briefing on the war, which I think will eventually, actually fairly soon, come to an end. We will have AEI scholar Josh Moravchik, who's going to be talking about public diplomacy, about anti-Americanism, about how we face up to that. We will have AEI scholar Richard Pearl, who's going to be talking about some of the issues that are going to be coming up with the Iraqi opposition and a variety of other issues. And one of our guests will be Janet Daly from the Daily Telegraph in London, who's going to be talking about the European questions. I think also, if a conversation I had yesterday afternoon is correct, that AEI scholar Michael Novak will also be joining us to talk about not only to talk about Europe, he just got back from Europe and from a visit to the Vatican, but he's also going to be talking about some of the religious components of what's going on, which I think will be absolutely fascinating.
And the whole focus is post-war Iraq.
The whole focus is what's going on right now. It's kind of a daily briefing, but inevitably we do talk about the bigger picture.
How has, two people have brought up the whole issue of the influence of AEI. How has AEI, or your life at AEI, changed since many of the people who are at AEI have been known to be advisors in this administration, and specifically in this war with Iraq?
Well, first of all, many people who had been at AEI are in the administration, and we're immensely proud of them. We think that making a better world is about sharing great ideas. And at a think tank, one of the liberties that you have is to think a little bit in the medium and the long term. The government doesn't do that very well. They tend to think about tomorrow and the next day. And so that's a luxury we have, and we have, I think we have terrific people. AEI has been talked about a lot, and I think that's because of the quality of the ideas that the people who are at AEI have. One of the greatest things that you can do is sell your ideas and share them with others.
Last call is Northville, Minnesota.
Hello?
Go ahead, Minnesota.
Yeah, this question for Danielle. Is there 3 tribal type of religions over in Iraq, or what?
Well, Iraq has always been actually a secular state, and it was only during the first Gulf War that Saddam Hussein decided that he should write Allahu Akbar, God is great, on the Iraqi flag. But before that, it wasn't on the Iraqi flag. Iraq is a complex ethnic and religious state. It is 65% Shia Muslim, and there is a much smaller number, a disputed percentage of Sunni Muslims, and then it is about, I don't want to get my percentages wrong, but there is a large proportion of Kurds who are actually Sunni Muslims but are not ethnic Arabs. So Iraq is a real melting pot. There are also Christians, there are ethnic Assyrians, there are Turkmen. It's an absolutely fascinating country. But you actually give me an opportunity to bring up something very important, because what a lot of people have said is that now that Saddam Hussein is gone, Iraq is going to explode in ethnic tensions, and that Sunni Arabs and Muslims and Shia are going to be at each other's throats, and that they're all going to be fighting with the Kurds. And I think it's important for us all to remember that historically, Iraq's people have been very nationalist. They have not fought with each other. Sunni and Shia have not confronted each other inside Iraq. To the contrary, Baghdad, in fact, 60 years ago, Baghdad was more than 50% Jewish. So Iraq has been, I wouldn't call it a tolerant country, I wouldn't call it necessarily a model, but it has not been a cauldron of ethnic or religious tensions. And one tiny little note in addition, Iraq's Shiites were loyal Iraqis. They fought against the Iranian government for 8 years in the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 88, and they were not a fifth column for Iran. So the idea that if Iraq's Shiites end up having some important role in a future Iraqi government, that Iraq will somehow become a satellite of Iran, I think is also very important to dispel. We have great hopes for the future of Iraq, and I think the people are really up to the challenge.
In a few minutes, we're going to be asking our viewers a question. I want to ask you what you think of this and whether the Pentagon should allow the Reverend Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, to do the religious ceremonies on Good Friday at the Pentagon. He has been invited to do so, and some Muslim groups who work at DOD, people who work at DOD who are Muslim, have complained about it. Because of Reverend Graham's earlier comments about Islam.
About Islam.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Franklin Graham's group Samaritan's Purse for some years when I was at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and there's no question these are this is Billy Graham's son, and I'm not going to pretend that this is a neutral group. On the other hand, Samaritan's Purse has done wonderful work. They send shoe boxes with presents for children throughout the Middle East. They have been enormously helpful to Palestinian children. They've done great work in the Sudan. They are a genuine humanitarian organization, and I'm not going to make excuses, and I'm not going to characterize what Franklin Graham has said, because he's a grown-up and he's accountable to himself. But the world is a big place, and there's room for all sorts of different ideas, and intolerance is not acceptable, but neither is exclusion. And I don't really like the idea that somehow people are blackballed from speaking in our public institutions, and the Pentagon is a public institution supported by the U.S. taxpayer.